Families boarding a flight, excited for their destinations, not knowing it'd be their last trip. It's heartbreaking, really. And that's what we're diving into today, this recent plane crash in D.C. and all the political stuff that came after.
Yeah, it really makes you think. Even now with all our technology and everything, this kind of tragedy can still happen just like that. And it shows how technology and politics and, just plain human emotions, how they all get mixed up together.
Right. We've got excerpts from pasted text. And the CBS News article is called "Trump Speaks About D.C. Plane Crash and Points Blame at DEI." They're pretty different takes on the same event. American Eagle Flight 5342 colliding with an Army Black Hawk helicopter right near Reagan National Airport. No survivors.
And it's, the first major U.S. commercial airline accident in over a decade. So it's a big deal. Kind of makes you think about how safe we really are up there.
Yeah, for sure. And then you've got former President Trump weighing in. He held a press briefing at the White House. Didn't take long for it to go beyond just expressing sympathy.
Yeah, he started with the condolences, the support for the families, all that. But then he shifted gears pretty quick. Started criticizing the Biden administration's DEI initiatives.
DEI, for those who might not know, that stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Basically, it's about making sure different groups are represented and included in organizations. In this case, we're talking about the aviation sector.
Right. And President Trump, well, he seemed to suggest that these DEI initiatives were somehow making things less safe. Even said something like, brilliant people have to be in those positions. Kind of implied that maybe the DEI hires weren't up to snuff.
Isn't it a little early to be saying that, though? I mean, shouldn't we wait for a proper investigation before we start blaming DEI? It just feels like he's using this tragedy to push an agenda.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It makes sense for a former president to be concerned about safety, sure. But to link DEI directly to the crash without any real proof, that's definitely going to stir things up. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions, especially with something this sensitive.
Absolutely. And his comments definitely got people talking. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, he called Trump's speculation inappropriate, especially with the family still grieving, even said it made him sick to his stomach.
Clearly, Trump's words hit a nerve. It's not just about this one event anymore. It's tied into this whole bigger debate about DEI, how much should representation matter compared to qualifications, and the fact that these kinds of events get so politicized. It's a lot.
And then, just when you think it couldn't get more complicated, you've got Defense Secretary Hegseth, who was at the briefing too. He mentions a possible elevation issue with the Black Hawk helicopter.
Right, and that's where the details get really important. An elevation issue, that could mean a problem with the altimeter, the thing that measures altitude, or maybe even a control malfunction. It just adds a whole other layer to the investigation.
Makes you wonder, if there really was a problem with the Black Hawks, would that take the heat off Trump's DEI claims? Or will this whole thing just keep being used for political points?
That's the question, isn't it? But before we get too deep into the political side of things, I think we need to understand how a mid-air collision even happens. They're so rare, Understanding why is really important for our analysis.
Totally agree. Before we jump to conclusions about who's to blame or political motives and all that, we need to understand the technical stuff. So, can you explain what factors could lead to a mid-air collision? Like, what would the experts be focusing on at this stage of the investigation?
Yeah, it's a complicated situation for sure. Figuring out how these mid-air collisions happen, that's a big piece of the puzzle, right? What are investigators looking at in cases like this?
Well, mid-air collisions, they don't happen often, thankfully, but when they do, it can be for a lot of different reasons. A lot of times, though, it comes down to what we call see and avoid procedures breaking down. Basically, pilots are trained to always be scanning for other aircraft. But things like bad weather, low visibility, even just the way some cockpits are designed, it can make it harder to see. So it's not always just about the pilot messing up. There's bigger picture stuff involved too.
Right. Investigators, they'll be looking closely at how air traffic control works, the communication between everyone, even the plane's transponder systems, the things that tell ground control and other planes where they are. They're looking for any little thing that could have contributed to the collision.
And what about Hegseth mentioning that elevation issue with the Black Hawk? Did that be some kind of mechanical problem?
It's possible, yeah. Blackhawks are usually pretty reliable, but they're complicated machines. An elevation issue, that could be anything. Maybe a problem with the altimeter, the thing that measures altitude, or maybe something wrong with the flight control systems. The investigators, they'll be going over the wreckage super carefully, analyzing the flight data recorders, doing all sorts of tests to figure out exactly what went wrong.
It really makes you realize this investigation, it's not just about pointing fingers. It's like they're digging deep into how planes work, the human element, all the complex systems that are supposed to keep things safe in the air.
Exactly. And even though all this political debate about DEI is a big part of this whole thing, it's important to remember the investigation itself, that's separate. It's about facts and
Huh.
evidence. And if we jump to conclusions before they finish, it can be really misleading, even harmful.
Yeah, it's almost like we're watching two stories play out at the same time. You've got the technical investigation trying to find answers, and then you've got all the political commentary putting their own spin on things.
That's a good way to put it. And it's a challenge for everyone, even for us, trying to make sense of it all. How do we separate the facts from the opinions? How do we avoid getting caught up in someone's agenda instead of focusing on the truth?
It really makes you think about how you process information these days, doesn't it? Especially with how fast news and misinformation travels these days.
Absolutely. Being a careful consumer of information, that's more important than ever. We have to ask questions, consider where the information is coming from, and be suspicious of anyone who acts like they've got it all figured out before all the evidence is in.
So going back to those two separate stories you mentioned,
Yeah.
how do you think they might, play off each other as things develop? Could the investigation actually prove or disprove the political arguments that are being made?
That's the big question. If the investigation finds out, say, that the pilot messed up, that might make some people think, okay, maybe hiring standards shouldn't be lowered, even if it's in the name of diversity.
But what if they find out it was a technical problem or some kind of system failure that had nothing to do with the pilots? Wouldn't that kind of shoot down the idea that DEI is to blame?
Exactly. Whatever they find could either support the arguments that are already out there or completely contradict them. And that's where things could get tricky. People with agendas, they might try to twist the findings to fit their own story, even if it doesn't match the evidence.
Man, that's a scary thought. It makes you realize how easy it is to use information as a weapon, especially when things are so politically charged.
Yeah, it definitely highlights the need for the investigation to be transparent and for the findings to be communicated clearly and fairly. People deserve to know the truth, without any political spin.
And speaking of people, this whole thing has sparked some pretty strong reactions all over the place. What are some of the main things you're seeing people concerned about?
One big thing is just, worry about aviation safety in general. People are shaken up, understandably. They want to know that something's being done to prevent this from happening again.
Yeah, that's a normal reaction, isn't it? When
Yeah.
something like this happens, it makes you think about your own safety and whether the systems we rely on are actually working.
For sure. And it goes beyond just the physical safety of flying, too. There's a growing concern that political agendas might start to influence decisions in important industries like aviation, decisions that should be based on evidence and safety.
So it's not just about this one crash. It's about, like, setting a precedent, how we deal with safety and diversity in other areas, too.
Right. People are watching this case closely. How it turns out could have a big impact on how we handle this whole mix of safety, inclusion, and political pressure in the future.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning. But before we go any further, maybe we should take a minute to recap what we've learned so far.
Sure. So we've looked at the plane crash itself, obviously, the immediate reactions from politicians, and the importance of the investigation that's going on right now. We talked about how complicated midair collisions are, the things that might cause them, and how important it is to separate the facts from the political opinions.
And we talked about the bigger picture, the concerns people have about flying, being safe, how DEI plays a role, and how information can be manipulated when there's so much political tension.
It's a multifaceted issue, no easy answers, but understanding all the details, the different sides of things, that can help us understand the information we're getting and make up our own minds.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Encouraging our listeners to think critically, to question what they hear, and to have real conversations, even when the topics are tough.
Exactly. That's how we learn, how we grow, and how we build a society where people are more informed and engaged.
So to our listeners, we've covered a lot today, but this is just the start of the conversation, really. It feels like we're left with more questions than answers after all that, but I guess that's kind of how it goes with these big, complicated events.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it is with complex situations, right? The more you learn, the more you realize there's still so much more to figure out. And this whole thing with the tragedy and the technology and the politics, it's a perfect example of that.
We talked about the crash, the investigation, the politics, the big picture stuff.
Mm.
But what I keep thinking about is the people.
Mm.
The families who lost someone. Their lives are changed forever because of this. It's easy to get caught up in all the details and the arguments, but we can't forget about that. The human cost.
Absolutely. Every headline, every statistic, it represents real people going through something we can barely imagine. And their stories, their grief, that's what matters most.
It's like we're looking at this from the outside, trying to analyze it, but for a lot of people, this is their life. This is their pain.
Right, and that brings up something really important, empathy. As we keep talking about this, as we break down the information and form our own opinions, we have to do it with empathy, with sensitivity.
Empathy for the victims and their families, for sure. Empathy for the people investigating the crash. Even empathy for people we might disagree with.
Yeah, even when we disagree, even when we're angry or frustrated, finding some common ground, trying to understand different perspectives, that's how we move forward. That's how we make progress.
So as things develop, what are some things our listeners should keep in mind? What questions should they be asking themselves?
The first thing is always, where is this information coming from? Who's saying it? And what's their angle? Are they giving you facts or are they just speculating, making guesses?
Like we said before, being a critical thinker, right? Questioning everything, not just accepting what you hear at face value.
Exactly. And don't trust anyone who acts like they've got all the answers figured out already. The truth, it usually comes out slowly, little by little, as more evidence is gathered and analyzed.
And as that happens, we have to remember, people can be biased. They can twist things. How are they framing the findings to fit their own story? What perspectives are they leaving out? What are we not hearing?
Those are the questions we have to ask, not just in this case, but with anything we see in the news. Being able to think critically, that's the key. It's how we navigate this world where there's so much information flying around, and it's not always clear what's true.
It's about being an informed citizen, someone who can have thoughtful conversations, debate things respectfully, and, in the end, help build a society where everyone is more informed. A better society.
And that's really what the deep dive is all about. Giving our listeners the tools they need, the different ways of looking at things so they can make sense of the world.
So to our listeners, as this investigation goes on and we learn more, remember, be critical, be open-minded, and be kind. Keep asking questions, keep trying to understand, and keep diving deep.
And until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.